So, Uncle Mark.
Yeah.
Listen, I don't know if you've heard about this. They've kind of kept it under the rug a little bit, but there's, what do you call it? A global pandemic. Still raging.
A plandemic.
Well, depends on where you are and who you ask. There's not much planning for almost anything at this point, but yes, people are getting sick and even dying.
Yes, loads of them. Loads of them.
And in this country, we've lost 500,000 people. Half a million.
Getting closer to 600, I think.
Yeah. I almost lost math entirely out of my brain. So we literally, a lot of people are dealing with the death of loved ones because of this. And if it's not because of that, guess what? Loved ones die in all of our lives, and we have to deal with that.
And as the pandemic is maybe waning, school shootings are on the way back up.
Oh,
so
what a cheerful place for you to have taken that.
America, we're coming back.
So anyway, we've brought on an expert in this sort of thing. Grieving, dealing with the concept of death. This is the host of the Dr. Death podcast. She is a non-religious hospice chaplain, an end-of-life educator, and a grief counselor, Dr. Terri Daniel. Welcome to the How To Heretic. Thanks so much for coming on.
Hey, you guys. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, it's wonderful that you've you actually found us before we found you, which I think is fun. And you've been a frequent interactor with us.
And we've been on her show.
Yeah, we've been on your show.
Yep, you were on Ask Dr. Death.
So it takes a little bit. I said Dr. Death, and I didn't say Ask Dr. Death. That is the name of the podcast. I apologize.
That's okay.
But yeah, I just thought, now is a time when we need to be talking about death and dying as non-believers, as non-religious people. It is a different animal entirely. And I took as my inspiration to contact you a comment in a Facebook post that I saw. It was the Facebook post said it was a guy talking about the fact that a loved one had just died, and he's in the middle of this grieving process. He's dealing with all of the emotions and the work that comes with people dying in your life, and then he has to deal with so many people on Facebook and in real life saying things like, I'm praying for you, they're in a better place, all of the sort of Christian/religious platitudes that you have to deal with. And it's just, can you talk a little bit about that, about the fact that we are non-believing mourners in a believer's world?
I can totally talk about that. I love that expression, non-believing mourners in a, what did you say, a religious world, whatever that is.
A believer's world, yeah.
A believer's
that was
world.
good, Dan.
Really
I did a good one.
I think that's the name of my next book.
I'm going to retire now.
You did it.
Yeah. So it's, those platitudes, not only are they offensive and horrible, they also reveal the infantile nature of the person's theology when they're saying that. Like when they say something like, God just needed another flower for his garden. And you want to say,
so awful.
Yeah, and you want to say, well, he's God. Why doesn't he just fucking make another flower?
Yeah, leave my mom here and have a
fuck your garden. Can I keep my dad?
Yeah, or make a flower out of thin air. You can do that. You're God, right? So when somebody says that stuff to you, there's like 4 things you can do. And you mostly have to understand how ignorant that person is, because what happens to everybody is we get our theological teaching as children, 3, 4, 5 years old, and we just kind of sit with it. It never really matures for most people. So when we're kids, we're taught how to behave. We're taught, how to be quiet in the library, look both ways when you cross the street, say please and thank you. But nobody teaches us how to be around death and how to interact with a person who's in deep mourning and deep pain. So we just go right to our theology because religious people have even fewer skills in that area. All they have is the beliefs they were indoctrinated with as children. So they offer you their infantile belief system. So the first thing you do is kind of give them a little bit of a break because they're just dumb and they don't know any better, if you can.
Well, we're all dumb and don't know any better. Like you're right. I was never taught how to deal with people, how to be cool around grieving people. So yeah, I think that's a good thing. We are all kind of dumb about it. So cutting people some slack is probably appropriate.
Yeah. And if the person is just so annoying, there's a couple of different things you can do. You can, if you feel strong and, like you can be the bigger person, just smile and say thank you and walk away and go talk to somebody else. That would be,
sure,
the calm and centered thing to do. Or you can stare at them angrily and then walk away. Or you can confront them and say, and how exactly is you praying going to help this situation?
Right.
But you're not going to like their answer because they're going to give you their big apologetic answer.
Right.
Yeah. You can look at them and say, so nothing. You're just going to do nothing. That's what prayer is.
I mean, it seems like really the only, when my dad died, which will be 10 years ago, this fall, I was surrounded by a whole bunch of people who were saying all of those things. And it's especially like, you don't want to create a scene at your loved one's funeral or whatever. So yeah, really what you have access to is thank you very much. And then hope that they don't continue talking.
I mean, I will play the devil's advocate, which is not normally what the role I play on this show when talking about believers. But I think there is underlying the ignorance and the do nothingness. I think there is a sincerity to a lot of those well wishes. Like,
oh yeah,
they are wishing you well. They are trying to say something nice. They just don't realize that it is kind of nothing.
Right.
Well, they're doing the only thing they are equipped to do. Right. That's all they have. And even though they're trying to make you feel better, what's really happening under that is they're just saying that stuff to make them feel better.
Yeah.
And so they're applying their religious beliefs as sort of a salve to soothe their own pain and discomfort. When they're standing with you and your father just died 3 days ago, that other person is extremely uncomfortable. They don't know how to act around you. They don't know what to say. They feel helpless. They want to help you, but they can't. So that's all they have in their toolbox. And what it really does is make them feel better. And maybe, if they really believe in prayer, they may really think that if they say some sort of prayer, I don't know what's supposed to happen. Is it supposed to make sure your father goes to heaven? Is it supposed to relieve your pain? What is it supposed to do?
Right. Yeah.
Nothing.
That's a very, yeah. It turns out that doesn't mean anything when someone says that, but boy, does it mean something to them. Boy, do they think they're doing something when they say it.
It makes them feel better. And if I could tell you a little story about that.
Please.
The reason I got into this business in the first place was my son died when he was 16 after a long illness. And I had a neighbor who was a missionary, and she and her husband would go to Africa and preach to people all the time. And it just happened she had brought this African woman back with her from wherever they were on their last mission. They kept one. Yes. And so she was
that is discouraged.
Yeah.
So she was at their house next door to me, and they came over, and the African woman, my son was still there laying on the bed, and he was already dead. And she sang this little song over him. And, the music was just beautiful. It was one of those beautiful indigenous kind of songs. And I just loved it. And I said, that's so beautiful. Will you sing it again? So she sang it a second time. And only then did I ask her what the words meant. and the words were, she was asking God to allow my son's soul to go to heaven. It was so offensive.
Yeah.
It's so offensive to think you have to ask permission for a perfect little soul.
Right.
It's like so stupid.
Yeah. A guiltless child.
That one was kind of on you for asking. If you had just let it be, you would have been fine.
Well, it's funny because I listen to African indigenous music all the time. It's like one of my Pandora stations, and I don't understand a word of any of it. And I just love it. Love listening to it. So
yeah.
It's
and now you've learned the lesson not to ask.
Not to ask.
It's better not to know the lyrics in many cases, right?
Yeah.
So maybe you can help us out with some. You say we're not raised, we're not given the tools to properly deal with someone who's in a place of deep grieving. Can you help us? Can you supply us with a few of those tools? Is there something you can?
Well, it's the hardest thing to do, and it's the most obvious, and it's very simply to just say nothing, say as little as possible. The grieving person isn't going to listen or hear you anyway. You're not there to teach them or direct them or even console them. You're just there to, as we say in chaplaincy, be present for them.
Right.
So you can, depending on who the person is in your relationship, you can sit down next to them and say, man, this sucks.
Yeah.
And they'll go, yeah. And then you just sit there and hold their hand and don't say anything.
Yeah. So don't just do something. Stand there.
Exactly. That's
right.
Exactly right. And it's not going to be an awkward silence because the person is in an altered state and isn't really expecting social conversation at that point anyway.
Well, and they're kind of probably very much hoping not to have social conversation, or if they want some, they'll lead it.
That's exactly right. And you do want them to lead it. And, in grief counseling and in chaplaincy, and of course, when I say chaplaincy, I'm talking about my style of non-religious chaplaincy. We're trained not to lead, but to create a space where the other person can lead. So if you just walk in and say, man, this sucks, then the other person is immediately going to start talking. Yeah. And you can sometimes fill it in with, my dad died 10 years ago, I've been where you are. But even that is kind of presumptuous.
Well, and it can make it about you
exactly.
or be perceived as making it about you.
Yeah. So, you just put yourself in the background, your story, your need to make someone else feel better. If you leave that all in the background and you just sit. Another thing, and really the most important thing, is there is something you can do. Help them with stuff. Don't say to people, is there anything I can do to help? Because they're never going to give you an answer. They're going to just say, no, I'm fine. Yeah. So if you're in their house, just go start cleaning up the kitchen, sweep the driveway, do whatever needs to be done. Don't even ask. Or you can, if the bathroom is filthy, just go up to the person and say, hey, I'm going to clean your bathroom.
Yeah.
And they'll say, fine, whatever, because they're not paying attention. And so you can do things for them.
Yeah. It's funny, isn't it? Like the way that I guess it's probably the same throughout most of the world, but the way that the family or the survivors of the deceased, so much work begins the moment they die. Right. That, oh my God, now I've got to arrange this funeral. Most people have no experience with that. It turns into a whole Megillah. Right. Now I've expected to, for lack of a better word, entertain people in the house, and I'm just barely keeping it together. Now I've got to get up and bare my soul in some, eulogy. It's like it's a tremendous amount of labor that suddenly falls on the bereaved. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm in the worst position of my emotional state of my life. Let's add public speaking to that. Yeah. That's
and
fun.
Like a $10,000 fucking, or however much a funeral costs, oh my God, now this, right?
Right.
It's so much labor falls on them all of a sudden.
And people don't prepare for this in advance. And of course, in hospice, we want everybody to have an advance directive. We want you to have your funeral plans already made and paid for. so that you don't have to dump that on your friends and your children and your family. And
Right.
the labor part is, the solution to that is find one person in your circle of friends who's responsible and capable
To
and
take charge.
competent, and let them take charge. Let them make all the phone calls, do all the things. You don't have to make a speech or say the eulogy, but a lot of people find that it's actually pretty healing to do that. I did the eulogy at my son's funeral and at my mother's, but I like public speaking. I'm comfortable with that. That's a very natural, organic place for me to be. So it was easy for me, but for other people, it's got to be terrible. Yet they choose to do it because it's part of the healing process for them.
Yeah, there's something to
so
that.
Sorry, Dan.
I was just going to say there's definitely something to that. I actually felt good about talking at my dad's funeral. Although I will say this, just as a quick pro tip, don't book yourself after a beautiful musical number. That is a very bad idea. That caused at least 30 seconds of awkward while I tried to compose myself. So
and Dan, you didn't, your dad was a practicing Mormon.
Yeah.
But you did not, am I correct? You did not hold the funeral in a Mormon ward house?
No, we didn't. I found a funeral home that looked pretty and that had a lovely view of the valley. And then, and I did sort of as my nod to his religion, I asked his Mormon bishop to give an opening prayer, but I didn't do a closing prayer, and I sure as fuck didn't let any of those bastards talk during the thing.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. And then, then you get into the whole religious thing. I had a family once where the father was Catholic. He made all his plans. He was very Catholic, and he wanted a mass. He had the whole thing figured out what he wanted when he died. And then he died. And one of his daughters was a born-again Christian, and she insisted on having the service at her, evangelical wacko Jesus church.
Right.
Oh, no.
Against the father's wishes. And the other sibling was trying to honor the father's wishes, and they had this huge battle. And so they ended up having two, one at the Catholic church and one at the other church.
Great.
Just because of religious rift. I mean,
what's better than arranging one funeral but two?
Yeah.
Yeah, and religion just so much gets in the way of it. And back to sort of theory on this, the reason we have religion is primarily so people have some kind of system for dealing with death.
Yeah.
That's kind of why it's created. So if you look at us, at a primitive level, like back in the early days of human history, shit happens, the baby died, the crops died, something happened, you had death and loss, and you'd sit around the fire with your tribe and saying, what happened? Why did that happen? And you start to make up mythologies that explain why bad things happen. And from that starts to have doctrine like, well, maybe if we, do our special worship dance for the sun or the rain or something more.
We'll appease the god of whatever.
Appease the god. So that's how the gods are created. It's 100% because of death.
What do you think about the idea of, early on in this podcast, we had a guy named Paige come on who's a psychotherapist, and we talked to him a little bit about grief and grieving, and he talked about rituals and about creating your own ritual and how, religion makes people, it's tricky because it has all these annoying side effects, but they actually have some useful things going on too. And one of them is that they have rituals that they can do that make people that give people comfort, give them a sense of, give them something to do if nothing else, but also give them a way to confront this that isn't just, sitting around crying.
Yeah, exactly. I'm so glad that you brought that up because I'm really big on ritual. In fact, I'm actually teaching a class on rituals at a seminary in the fall to chaplaincy students. So yes, absolutely, 100% on rituals. It does give you something to do. It's almost a form of occupational therapy. It gives you like little things that you can make, representational objects, and then you carry it outside and you bury it in the earth. That part of it is really helpful, but it also gives form to the formless. So your grief and your pain and the trauma you experienced and the love that you have for the person, these things can't be defined in words or images. So ritual makes a representation of it. So if you, paint "I love you" on a rock and take that rock to the cemetery and put it next to the grave or in the grave, you've now given form to the love and put it in to the funeral, and you've made a ritual that expresses something. And the thing about rituals is they don't have to have any kind of religious context at all.
Right.
And so, yeah, it's really important for people to create their own rituals. There's some wonderful books. There's a book called Sacred Ceremony that I'm using as a textbook in my class that has wonderful rituals for every rite of passage: death, birth, menopause, buying a house, all of this. And think about, the rituals that people just normally accept. Like when you get married, you're supposed to carry the bride over the threshold.
Right.
That's a ritual. Everybody does it.
Yeah. And I mean, our lives just in any culture are full of rituals that most of us don't even know the origin of, right? It's just simply something you do. You throw rice at the wedding, right?
Yeah.
And
I think one of the nice things about being non-religious and and looking at the world through that lens is that you get to create your own rituals, that the ritual doesn't have to be tied to anybody else's thing. You can do what feels right for you, or you can imagine something and then just make it so. It doesn't have to be, maybe there's extra pressure to do it if you don't know how, but I just think that that's a lovely thought.
Yeah, being non-religious gives you, unlimited freedom to connect with yourself and others, and perhaps the non-ordinary reality, multidimensional world outside of the physical realm. All of those things, you have the opportunity to connect with those things in a way that fits for you and suits you, using the words that you like, the symbols that you like, all of those things. And prayer, I have to deal with prayer all the time because,
sure.
As a hospice chaplain, and I never offer prayer to the patients that I see, but sometimes they'll ask me to pray for them or with them. And I will just, I'll make up my own prayer. And what I basically say to them, and I don't think they really like this, but I say, take a deep breath, open your heart, feel the essence of who you are, and find the place in yourself where you have the strength to cope with this difficult situation and accept the outcome for whatever it is.
That's beautiful.
With grace and love.
Yeah.
That is beautiful.
That's a totally non-religious prayer.
So when we were on your show, Dr. Terri, a while ago, we were talking, and I asked you, in your experience, in hospice care and hospital care with dying patients, what group you found struggled with the situation the most. And if I recall correctly, you said it was the atheist people.
I would say the atheists and the Christians probably equally.
Interesting.
And so with the atheists, and you don't see many of them in hospice, and because if there are, they don't,
because we live forever.
That's right. And then and there's not a checkbox on the intake form.
Of
for
course,
atheists.
there's not.
They usually say other. I've seen a lot of atheists get really panicky at the end of life because they feel like they have regrets. They missed out. One man I remember was just so upset because he never got to go on a sailboat race, which was his big dream. And he just had this one choice.
What? If you've lived a long life, and that is your biggest regret, hats off to you.
Yeah.
Right.
That's a good one. But then they also have the regrets about relationships and forgiveness.
Yeah, sure.
But it's really, it's really the Christians that get the most upset because of hell. They're really concerned about going to hell.
That's it. What a terrifying thing to have had this concept sort of ethereally floating around in your noodle for your whole life, and then suddenly it becomes concrete, and you have to ask yourself, did I do enough? Do I get to go to heaven? Am I going to see the people that I'm supposed to see in the afterlife, or am I going to be denied that thing? That's a terrifying thing to.
It's terrifying, and that's that's the essence of toxic theology. Toxic theology really grabs you when you're dying or grieving. Those are the times when you're the most vulnerable to it.
How do you?
It's non-canonical, right? I mean, it's that they've been given this thing that really isn't part of the founding texts of Christianity.
It is completely non-canonical.
Yeah, it got made up along the way.
When someone comes to you with that kind of terror in their minds about about not going to heaven, or even the atheists, when they come to you and are so regretful about the things that they have or haven't been able to do in their lives,
what you would not say to the atheist is, don't worry, you'll get to go do a sailboat race in your next life.
Right. Yeah, that's not a very helpful thing.
So that's where ritual comes in. So let's just use the sailboat guy as an example.
Okay, great.
I could have him and his family do like a little art therapy process where he draws a picture of a boat on the water and, just kind of creates a little scene and does perhaps a meditation on that. So like as he's dying, he can imagine that he's floating away on the water on a boat. There's like readings and poetry and things that you can read that are that there's a lot of boat and water analogies in
sure.
care.
Sure.
So something like that would be really helpful for a guy like that. For the Christians who are terrified of hell, I actually use this one example in the classes that I teach. I had this guy once who been diagnosed with the 3rd stage, 4th stage cancer. He was dying. He was about 70. And he's told me, I was a really bad dude my whole life. I was a meth dealer. I beat up women. I was a criminal. It was, and he told me, and he said, but one day I was with my biker brothers and we were camping someplace, and there was this Christian encampment there at the campground. And they were having a big revival, and I walked over there and I ended up getting saved. And so I found Jesus and I became a Christian, but I still went back to my criminal, horrible life. It didn't change anything. And now here it is 30 years later and I'm dying. And my question to you, Chaplain Terri, is, am I going to go to hell or am I going to go to heaven? Am I saved or am I not saved? It's a great example for teaching, right?
Yeah, that's a great question.
So
and could he hear you as you put the pillow over his face? He was a horrible human being.
It was such a great opportunity to use one of the number one tools that we have in chaplaincy, which is called reflection. So you reflect somebody's philosophy or belief or whatever they say, you reflect it, we put it right back in their lap. You don't give them an answer because I don't have an answer to that question.
Right.
So I said, well, do you still consider yourself a Christian? He says, yes. I said, well, then what does your faith tell you? Tell me what the belief system says about this. Or what does the doctrine say? And he said, well, it says that, as long as I have Jesus, even if it's at the last minute on my deathbed, I'm going with Jesus to heaven. And so I said, so you just answered your own question.
Your answer is bullshit, but it's your answer. So.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, exactly.
And so it made him feel better. And you go where your belief system says you're going to go. So I said, dude, you're good to go.
Yeah. Wow. I think regardless of what, obviously I don't believe in an afterlife, but dude, you're good to go is probably just the right thing to say to a dying person.
To a dying meth dealer.
Meth dealer. Yeah, I mean, I loved this guy. I mean, he was a real badass. He's covered with tattoos, broken teeth, the whole thing. And he was happy after that conversation. And I didn't tell him anything.
Right.
I just put him back into himself.
Wow. Now, you are, as we're wrapping up here, you are also speaking. We just talked to Nate Phelps a couple weeks ago.
Yes, indeed.
And you are speaking at an event he's speaking at as well. You want to tell us a little bit about that before we go?
Yes, the Conference on Religious Trauma. And Nate is there, plus a bunch of other amazing luminaries. Marlene Winnell, I believe, is there. I think you guys know her.
Yep.
I can't give you the website because it's kind of a weird website, but I can give it to you and you can post it in the show notes.
Sure.
It's online. It's 3 days. It's all the experts in religious trauma, therapists who help people with religious trauma. Nate Phelps, of course. Jeremiah Kamara is a really interesting guy who made a film about faith in the Black church and how that particular theology has contributed to keeping that particular community kind of suppressed and oppressed.
Interesting. Yeah.
So there's you should interview that guy.
I'll have to watch that. Yeah, that's
and the film it's on. It's called Contradiction: A Question of Faith, and it's on Amazon Prime.
Oh, excellent.
So yes, please, everybody, all you listeners out there, come to the conference on religious trauma. I think it's the third weekend in May, and it's
just a virtual conference.
It's a virtual conference. Yes.
All right.
And then where can people find you, Dr. Terri, if they want to follow you or get in contact with you, etc.?
The best place to find me is spiritualityandgrief.com. There's a lot of different places to find me, but you're
kind of all over the place.
I am all over the place.
You got too many jobs, lady.
I do have too many jobs, but that's the best one in terms of religion and grief. I'm about to start a grief support group that's based on my new book, which is called Grief and God: When Religion Does More Harm Than Healing. And I'm starting a support group for people who have struggled with grief because of the effect of toxic theology. So that kind of stuff can be found on spiritualityandgrief.com.
I have a feeling more than a few of our listeners will have an interest in that. So,
yes. Yeah.
So,
I hope so. I would love to interact with them. It's going to be a really good little program.
Well,
Fantastic.
Dr. Terri Daniel, you're doing the Lord's work out there. We really appreciate you, and we'll have you back on another time sometime.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for
love you guys to pieces. Thank you.
Love you back.